I found the listing on an obscure section of Craigslist, buried under a pile of other short-term rentals. It was advertised as a secluded cabin retreat for writers, located deep in the Oregon woods, far from the noise and distractions of the city. The photos looked simple but inviting: a rustic wooden structure, a small front porch, and a clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. The price was cheap, too cheap. I should have taken that as a red flag. But at the time, I was desperate for solitude. I had a deadline looming for my manuscript, and I needed to get away from everything. So, I emailed the owner, a man named Greg, who responded within the hour. The cabin is available. No cell service, but there's a landline in case of emergencies. Keys will be under the mat. Payment up front. No refunds. Enjoy your stay. That last part, no refunds, should have been another red flag, but I was too eager to care. I packed my car, drove 6 hours into the deep woods, and arrived at the cabin just before dusk. The place looked older than the pictures. The wood was darker, more worn. The windows had been nailed shut from the outside, something I didn't understand at first. The air smelled damp, a mix of wet pine needles and mildew. I told myself it was just the natural smell of an old cabin. Inside, it was even worse. Dust coated every surface. The furniture was mismatched. An old rocking chair, a scratched wooden table, a sagging couch that looked like it had been dragged in from the side of the road. The landline Greg mentioned was a rotary phone, its cord coiled like a snake on the floor. I set my bag down in the bedroom. The bed was small, the mattress thin. A single window overlooked the forest, but the glass was filthy, making it impossible to see clearly outside. As I was unpacking, I noticed something odd. A pile of cigarette butts in an ashtray on the nightstand. I didn't smoke. My stomach tightened. Maybe Greg had stayed here recently to clean up and left those behind. I tried to brush it off, but something about it felt wrong. I pushed the thought aside and told myself I was overthinking it. That night, I struggled to sleep. The silence was unnatural. In the city, I was used to the hum of traffic, the occasional siren, people's voices in the distance. Here, there was nothing, just an eerie, suffocating quiet. Then, around midnight, I heard a noise, a soft creak from the main room. I froze, listening. Another creak, then silence. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. It had to be the cabin settling, I told myself. Old wood shifting as the temperature dropped. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The next morning, I decided to take a walk around the property, clear my head. That's when I found the footprints. They were in the dirt just outside the back door. Fresh, deep impressions from heavy boots circling the cabin. I hadn't been back there yet. I felt the first real wave of fear settle into my chest. Someone had been here, maybe last night, maybe right now watching from the trees. I forced myself to breathe, to stay rational. Maybe Greg had been by to check on the place. Maybe another hiker had wandered too close. But I knew that wasn't right. These footprints weren't casual. They circled the cabin deliberately, like someone had been watching. I hurried inside and locked the doors. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I would leave in the morning if I still felt uneasy. I forced myself to write, trying to drown out the gnawing feeling in my gut. That night, I heard it again. A creaking sound, but this time it wasn't coming from the main room. It was coming from above me, the attic. I hadn't even realized the cabin had an attic until that moment. My pulse quickened. I stared at the ceiling, listening. A long, slow creak, then another. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped into the hallway. The attic entrance was a square wooden panel in the ceiling, slightly off-center. There was no pull-down ladder, just a small lip where someone could push it open. I shined the flashlight up at it. My breath caught in my throat. There were scratches along the wood, deep gouges like someone had clawed at it from inside. I backed away slowly, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch, facing the attic entrance, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. By the third night, I was exhausted, running on adrenaline. I told myself I was being irrational. That's when I found the beer can. It was sitting on the counter, empty. I hadn't brought any beer. I stared at it, my skin crawling. Had I just not noticed it before? No, I had cleaned up the kitchen when I arrived. This wasn't mine. Someone else was in the cabin. The realization sent me into a full-blown panic. I grabbed my bag and rushed for the door, but something made me stop. I turned slowly and looked toward the bedroom. The closet door was ajar. I hadn't left it that way. A breath of cold air slid down my spine. I knew I had two choices: run for my car and leave everything behind, or check the closet. I forced myself to step forward, flashlight shaking in my grip. I reached out, grabbed the edge of the closet door, and yanked it open. Nothing, just old coats and empty shelves. But then I noticed something: scuffed floorboards at the back of the closet, like they had been moved recently. I crouched down and pressed my hand against them. They shifted under my touch. A loose panel. I pried it open. Beneath it was a small, dark space just big enough for a person to hide. And inside, there was a crumpled sleeping bag. Someone had been living in the cabin. While I was there, I didn't think. I ran, grabbed my keys, threw open the door, and sprinted to my car. I half expected someone to come lunging out of the woods after me, but nothing happened. Just silence. I peeled out onto the dirt road, not stopping until I reached the nearest gas station, miles away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone as I called the police. When they arrived at the cabin, they found signs that someone had been staying there. Food wrappers, dirty clothes, more cigarette butts. But no person. Greg, the man who had rented me the cabin, was never found. His Craigslist account was deleted. His phone number disconnected. I never got my money back, but I didn't care. I was just grateful to be alive. I still wonder who was staying in that cabin, how long they had been there before I arrived, and most terrifying of all, what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. I have always been an avid backpacker, drawn to the solitude and unpredictability of the wilderness. Something about being deep in the woods, away from the distractions of modern life, brought me a sense of peace. My friend Mark felt the same way. Over the years, we had explored countless trails together, seeking out the most remote locations where we could set up camp and experience nature in its purest form. One autumn, we planned a long weekend hike through a dense stretch of forest in Pennsylvania. The area was rugged and infrequently visited, which made it all the more appealing. We set out on a Friday morning, carrying everything we needed on our backs. The air was crisp, the scent of fallen leaves thick around us as we followed an old logging road deeper into the woods. By late afternoon, the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows through the trees. We were miles from any marked trails, navigating with a topographic map and compass. The plan was to set up camp near a small stream, but as we crested a hill, we spotted something unexpected nestled among the trees. A cabin. It was old, almost blending into the forest with its dark, weathered wood. The windows were cracked, some missing glass altogether. The roof sagged slightly under years of neglect. There were no visible paths leading to it, no signs of recent human activity. Mark and I exchanged glances. "Think anyone still uses it?" he asked. I shrugged. "Doesn't look like it. Probably abandoned." We approached cautiously, stepping over fallen branches and patches of moss that had overtaken the ground. The door was slightly ajar, hanging off its hinges. With a gentle push, it creaked open, revealing a dim interior. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by our presence. Inside, the cabin was simple. A rusted wood stove stood against one wall, an old cot along another. A few rickety chairs and a table occupied the center of the room. There were empty tin cans and a stack of firewood in the corner, suggesting someone had used the place at some point. Mark exhaled, setting his pack down. "This beats sleeping in a tent," he said with a grin. "At least we'll have walls around us." I hesitated. There was something unsettling about the place, an air of forgotten history that lingered. Still, the thought of a solid roof over our heads was tempting. "All right," I agreed, "but let's make sure it's really empty." We did a quick sweep. The cabin was small, just one main room with a back storage space that had collapsed in on itself. There were no footprints in the dust, no personal belongings left behind. Whoever had once stayed here was long gone. As the sun set, we gathered firewood from the surrounding forest, lighting a small fire in the cabin's stove. The warmth filled the space, and the flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls. We cooked a simple meal of instant noodles, ate in relative silence, and stretched out our sleeping bags on the wooden floor. Outside, the night was still. No distant hum of cars, no artificial lights, just the deep quiet of the wilderness. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned low, leaving only a faint glow in the stove. The air was cold. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it. A noise outside. Something was moving through the underbrush. Slow, deliberate steps. I turned my head slightly to see Mark, still asleep in his bag. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the sound. It wasn't the scurrying of small animals or the rustling of wind through branches. This was different. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. I sat up carefully, my heart hammering. The noise stopped. For a moment, everything was still again. I exhaled, telling myself it was probably a deer moving through the woods. But then the dragging sound resumed, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. I reached over, shaking Mark awake. He stirred, groggy. "What?" he mumbled. "Listen." He blinked, sitting up. The sound had stopped again. Silence stretched between us, thick and expectant. Then we heard it, a soft thud against the cabin's wall. Mark was fully awake now, his expression mirroring my unease. We sat motionless, waiting. Another thud, then another, like something pressing against the outside of the cabin. Slowly, Mark reached for his flashlight and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness as he aimed it toward the windows. The broken glass reflected the light in odd patterns, making it difficult to see beyond. Then a shadow moved. Something or someone was standing just outside. Mark's grip tightened on the flashlight. We exchanged a look, neither of us wanting to say what we were both thinking. Then, a new sound, metal on wood. The sound of the cabin's door handle being tested. I reached for the hatchet I kept in my pack, gripping it tightly. Mark stood slowly, positioning himself near the door. "Who's there?" he called out. Silence. Then, suddenly, footsteps, heavy and fast, rushing away from the cabin into the woods. We waited, barely breathing, until the sounds faded completely. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, Mark exhaled. "We need to leave at first light." I nodded. Neither of us dared to go outside that night. We sat with our backs to the wall, watching the door until exhaustion finally claimed us. At dawn, we packed up quickly. Before leaving, we circled the cabin, looking for any sign of what had been there. Near the door, we found them. Deep gouges in the wooden wall, like someone had been scraping at it. Drag marks led into the forest, disappearing among the trees. We never did find out who or what had been outside that night. We just knew we weren't alone. I needed a break from everything. Work had been exhausting, My social life was in shambles, and I just wanted a weekend of solitude. That's how I ended up renting an off-grid cabin deep in the Adirondacks. No running water, no electricity, just a wood stove, a well outside, and absolute silence. The listing had seemed perfect. The owner, a guy named Carl, warned me up front about the isolation, saying, "You might hear forest noises at night. Don't let them spook you. It's just the woods." That didn't bother me. In fact, I looked forward to it. 2 nights alone, no distractions, just peace. I booked it immediately. The drive out there was longer than I expected. Miles of winding roads that eventually turned to dirt. My phone lost service about an hour before I even reached the property. The last stretch of road was barely a road at all, more like a pair of old tire tracks cutting through thick trees. When I finally arrived, the cabin stood alone in a clearing, exactly as advertised, small, wooden, with a covered porch and a metal chimney. It looked rustic but sturdy. I stepped out of my car and breathed in the crisp air. The woods stretched endlessly around me, and for the first time in months, I felt relaxed. I grabbed my bag, walked up to the door, and turned the key Carl had left in a small lockbox. The door creaked open. Inside, it was simple. A cot against the wall, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, a few shelves, and a cast-iron wood stove. A stack of firewood sat neatly beside it. The only other door led to a tiny bathroom with a dry toilet. Everything smelled of pine and dust. I unpacked quickly, then went outside to explore. Behind the cabin, a narrow trail led deeper into the forest. I followed it for about 15 minutes, enjoying the silence, before deciding to turn back. As I walked, I noticed something strange. Faint, old footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were too deep, too wide. But Carl had mentioned hikers sometimes passed through. I brushed it off. That night, after a simple meal cooked on a propane burner, I settled in with a book. The quiet was overwhelming but peaceful. Outside, crickets chirped, and the wind rustled through the trees. I let the sound lull me to sleep. I woke up to something scratching at the walls. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, but the sound wasn't random. It was deliberate, moving along the length of the cabin like someone or something was feeling its way along the exterior. I sat up in the darkness, heart pounding. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light across the room. I listened, barely breathing. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. It stopped at the front door. I reached for the flashlight beside my cot and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness as I pointed it toward the door. Silence. The scratching had stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Minutes passed. I heard nothing else. Maybe it was just the wind against tree branches. I convinced myself that's all it was, blew out a shaky breath, and forced myself to lie back down. Eventually, I fell asleep again. The next morning, I found footprints outside. Not mine. They circled the cabin, fresh in the dirt. They were boot prints, big ones, and they led to the back of the cabin, right to the wall where I'd heard the scratching. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was someone messing with me? A hiker playing a prank? But how would they even know I was here? I told no one but Carl, and he had no reason to come all the way out here. I checked around the cabin but saw no one. The trees were thick, the woods silent. I tried to shake the unease and spent the day hiking, exploring further down the trail. But I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting. I made dinner, trying to focus on the peace I'd come here for. As the darkness settled in, I locked the door, something I hadn't done the night before. At around midnight, I woke up again. This time, I heard voices outside, faint, murmuring, almost like whispers. I sat up, heart hammering. The whispers weren't close, but they weren't far either. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated. If I shined it through the window, would I see something I didn't want to? The murmuring stopped. A branch cracked outside. Then another. Something was out there, and it wasn't an animal. I clenched my flashlight, breathing hard. My car was parked just outside, but I'd have to unlock the door, run across the open space, and fumble with my keys. Too risky. I stayed put, waiting. For what felt like hours, I heard nothing. Just the occasional rustling of leaves. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. When I stepped outside in the morning, my stomach dropped. There were more footprints, more than one set, and they weren't just circling the cabin anymore. They were leading away, into the woods. I followed them, my breath quickening. They led to the trail I had hiked yesterday. They stopped a few feet in, and then vanished, as if whoever made them had simply disappeared. That was enough for me. I packed up my things in minutes, threw them in my car, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I hit paved highway. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking. I never told Carl what happened. I never left a review, and I never went back. But sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night, sure I hear whispers outside my window. It started as a casual mention on an outdoor survival forum. A guy claimed to have found an abandoned cabin deep in the mountains of Colorado and left vague directions for others to find it. He described it as old but sturdy, tucked away from any marked trails, and completely free for anyone who wanted to use it. At the time, I was in my late 20s and I had a deep love for remote camping. I didn't mind roughing it, and the idea of stumbling upon a hidden gem in the wilderness sounded perfect. I convinced my two friends, Eric and Dave, to come along for a 3-day trip. We had no idea what we were walking into. We followed the instructions posted on the forum, printing them out and marking key points on a topo map. It took us a full day of hiking through dense pine forests and rugged, uneven terrain. There was no trail, just natural landmarks. Rock outcroppings, a dried riverbed, an old hunting blind half collapsed under the weight of time. By the time we reached what we thought was the right area, the sun was starting to dip below the treetops. We were exhausted, hungry, and beginning to doubt whether the cabin even existed. But then, through a break in the trees, we saw it. The cabin was small, barely larger than a one-room shack, built from old weathered logs with a rusted tin roof. Overgrowth had begun to reclaim it, vines creeping up the walls and grass pushing through the gaps in the stone foundation. There were no windows, just a single door with a makeshift latch. We approached cautiously, half expecting the place to be filled with animal nests or a bear looking for shelter. But when we pushed the door open, the inside was surprisingly intact. Dusty but dry, with an old wood-burning stove, a rickety wooden table, and a rocking chair that sat eerily in the center of the room. Against the far wall was a stack of canned food, long expired but still neatly arranged. "Looks like someone actually lived here," Eric muttered, running his fingers over a knife mark in the table. "No way," Dave countered. "Not recently, at least. This place has been abandoned for years." The thought was comforting in a way. If no one had used it in years, that meant we weren't intruding. We set up our sleeping bags inside, started a small fire outside to cook dinner, and settled in for the night. At first, it felt peaceful. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of night creatures. But as the night deepened, the noises changed. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees with an eerie moan. Twigs snapped in the distance, maybe just animals, but the sounds felt deliberate. Inside, the cabin had an unsettling stillness. The rocking chair, though empty, seemed to creak ever so slightly, as if shifting under unseen weight. I told myself it was just the uneven floorboards adjusting. Sometime in the early morning, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I stepped outside into the freezing night air, my breath fogging in front of me. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. They weren't ours. The prints were fresh, made by someone wearing heavy boots, and they led from the tree line to the cabin and then back again. A sickening feeling settled in my stomach. Someone had been out here watching us while we slept. I rushed back inside and shook Eric awake. "Someone's been here." "What?" he mumbled groggily. I motioned for him to follow, and we both stepped outside. By then, the footprints had started fading under a thin layer of frost, but they were still visible enough to confirm I wasn't imagining things. "We would have heard someone," Eric whispered. I wanted to believe him, but the unease in my gut told me otherwise. The next day, we decided to do a thorough check of the cabin and the surrounding area. We found nothing unusual outside, no signs of recent human activity, no gear, no trash, just those footprints leading back into the woods. Inside, we started moving the old furniture around, just to see if there was anything worth noting. That's when Dave, dragging the rocking chair aside, found the trapdoor. It had been hidden under a filthy, dust-covered rug. The wooden door was reinforced with iron hinges, but there was no lock, just a simple handle. We hesitated. The cabin had already started to feel wrong. Did we really want to know what was beneath it? Curiosity won. Eric grabbed the handle and pulled. The door groaned open, revealing a small, dirt-walled space below. A root cellar, maybe, but there was no food stored down there. Instead, we saw 2 old sleeping bags, flattened with use, a rusted lantern, a pile of cigarette butts. Someone had been living here. Recently, Dave swore under his breath. "We need to get out of here." I agreed. We had enough food and water to make it back without another overnight stay. But as we started packing, something caught my eye. On the back of the door, carved into the wood, were words. "Leave now. They watch." A cold dread settled over us. Whoever had written that message had been here before us, and they had been afraid. We left in a hurry, stuffing our gear into our packs and dousing the fire before heading back into the woods. We moved fast, too fast. It was dangerous to rush through unfamiliar terrain, but none of us wanted to spend another second near that cabin. A few miles in, we stopped to catch our breath. That's when we heard it. Footsteps, not ours, not animals. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the trees behind us. Then came the whistle, a long, slow, almost melodic sound, like someone signaling. A second whistle answered from deeper in the forest. We ran. Branches tore at our clothes. Our packs weighed us down, but adrenaline pushed us forward. We didn't stop, didn't look back. We moved until our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. Only when we reached the edge of the forest, where our car was parked near an old logging road, did we dare to stop. The woods behind us were silent. Nothing moved. But we knew we were not alone. We threw our gear in the car and peeled out of there, gravel spraying as we sped down the dirt road. Only when we reached the highway did we finally breathe. None of us spoke on the drive home. We never went back. I checked the forum post a week later. It had been deleted. The user who posted it was gone. And the free cabin? If it's still out there, I don't want to know who's using it now. When my uncle passed away, he left me a cabin in the Montana wilderness. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. We weren't close, and I wasn't even expecting to be mentioned in his will. But when the lawyer contacted me, he explained that my uncle had specifically requested I take ownership of the place. There was no explanation, no sentimental letter, just a key, an address, and the official transfer of property. I wasn't sure what to do with it at first. I had never even been to the cabin, and as far as I knew, my uncle had lived there alone for years. I figured I'd visit, see what kind of condition it was in, and then decide whether to sell it or keep it as a weekend getaway. I had no idea what I was walking into. The drive took me deep into the Montana wilderness. The roads went from paved to gravel to dirt, and then barely more than a trail cutting through dense pine forest. My truck bounced over deep ruts and rocks, and I worried I'd get stuck out there with no cell service. I finally found the place, a small wooden cabin nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. The place was old, built from thick logs that had darkened with age. The roof sagged slightly, but it looked sturdy enough. As I stepped out of my truck, everything was silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness. The wind didn't even seem to reach this part of the forest. I approached the cabin cautiously. The key fit, but I hesitated before turning it. Something felt off. The door creaked open, revealing a musty interior. Dust clung to every surface, but everything was still in place. My uncle's boots by the door, an old coffee cup sitting on the wooden table, a book left open on the armrest of a worn-out chair. It was as if he had just stepped out for a moment and never returned. I explored the small space. The main room had a wood-burning stove, a kitchenette, and a single armchair facing a tiny bookshelf. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom with a stiff, moth-eaten bed and a cramped bathroom. But what caught my attention immediately was the thick metal bar across the inside of the door. It wasn't a simple lock. It was reinforced, heavy-duty, something meant to keep something out. I ran my fingers over the scratches on the wood around the doorframe. Long, deep gouges, like something had desperately tried to claw its way inside. I convinced myself it was just from an old bear attack or something similar. Maybe my uncle had a close call once and overreacted. I brushed it off, unloaded my gear, and decided to stay the night. The cabin had no electricity, just an old generator outside, which I got running with some effort. The single bulb inside flickered dimly, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. As the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped fast. I lit a fire in the stove and sat in the armchair, listening to the crackling flames. I tried to relax, but something about the place made my skin crawl. I kept glancing at the door, at the scratches, at the heavy bar across it. Then, around midnight, I heard it, a soft rustling outside. Faint, deliberate footsteps crunching in the underbrush. Not the random movements of an animal, something walking. I held my breath. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow and methodical. My fingers tightened around the handle of the hunting knife I had brought. I told myself it was just my imagination, just my nerves playing tricks on me in the unfamiliar silence of the wilderness. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly jumped out of my chair. The metal bar held firm, but the knob twisted back and forth, testing the lock. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the door. The rattling stopped. I didn't move for the next hour. Eventually, the noises outside faded, and I convinced myself it was just some animal sniffing around. But deep down, I knew better. I woke up exhausted. I barely slept, jolting awake at every little creak and groan of the cabin. In the daylight, everything seemed normal again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there last night. I decided to check the area around the cabin. The ground was dry, but near the edge of the clearing, I found something that made my stomach turn. Footprints. Human footprints. Barefoot, deep set in the dirt, circling the cabin. And they weren't mine. I packed my things. I was ready to leave. But as I threw my duffel bag into the truck, I stopped. Something in me needed to understand what was going on. My uncle had lived here for years. Had he been dealing with this the whole time? Why had he left the cabin to me? I decided to stay one more night, but this time I'd be ready. I barricaded the door, made sure my knife was within reach, and sat in the armchair, waiting. The night stretched on, cold and quiet. My fingers tapped against the armrest, my ears straining for any sound outside. And then, the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. I turned off the lamp, gripping my knife. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by slow, deliberate footsteps. Then something pressed against the door. A long, deep exhale. I could hear it breathing. I held my breath. Then, a long, slow scratch against the wood. My heart pounded. My grip tightened. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. And then suddenly silence. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, I finally worked up the courage to open the door. The ground outside was disturbed. Long drag marks in the dirt, leading away into the trees. My uncle's words came back to me. The fact that he had left me this place, the reinforced door, the way his things had been left like he had meant to come back but never did. I didn't wait to find out more. I got in my truck and left, driving as fast as I could back to town. I never went back. I put the cabin up for sale, and when no one bought it, I stopped thinking about it. But sometimes, late at night, I still wonder, had my uncle left the cabin to me as a gift or as a warning?